So welcome everyone. We're here now in our book group on Teresa of Avila, the interior castle, and we're looking at the fifth dwelling place, So I thought what we might do this week is just have a look at one of the modes of language that Teresa keeps returning to in her attempt to try and find the best way to explain her experience of prayer. And of course, you will know what it is because it's analogy, and we have a number of wonderful analogies in this dwelling place. It's really interesting that if you chart Teresa's use of analogy, that it actually increases quite a lot in this stage in her book. So she's moved, as we spoke about a few weeks ago, she's moved from into much more mystical language. So it's finding it's getting harder and harder for her to actually explain her experiences. And so it seems quite natural that to actually do that, she needs to move in much more allegorical and figurative language to try and express her meaning. So in the fourth dwelling, we had a wonderful analogy, which I'm sure a lot of you relate to, which is that of the water troughs. And she describes, if you remember, how the troughs can be filled with water in two very different ways to express the difference between acquired and infused prayer. One of the troughs is about filling it with water that's channeled through lots of aqueducts. And it gave us the sense that actually this was something that was built by great ingenuity, but also a lot of time. And it was something that was constructed to enable the water to flow. Well, the other is filled by a spring that's bubbling up from the very spot where the trough is. So we get this beautiful, really a wonderful, effective images that express this difference between the two forms of prayer. She does this really well because we can imagine in our minds these two water troughs, but also we kind of get it in a sort of subconscious, non-cognitive way of what she's really trying to talk about. And it's interesting when we think about this that Teresa is also very aware that these images are just images and they're only that. So not to mix up actually what she's saying with the image itself. She doesn't actually express this overtly as some of the other mystics would when they say, I'm not really looking at this. You have to kind of understand this is how I'm imagining it and seeing it now, but it's not literally like this. But instead, she goes on in a very subtle way to sort of, guide us into. Oops. There we go. I'm back. Don't get confused between what I'm talking about allegorically and the real thing itself. And she does this with the troughs. She doesn't express this overtly, as I say, but she's very clear that one's worth is not judged by its passive character, but rather, as she says, it is in the effects and deeds following afterwards that one discerns the true value of prayer. So basically what she's saying there is, you're talking about a spring bubbling up, but actually, that doesn't mean that you're very much in a kind of, passive way, just waiting for the spring to bubble, but actually that even in this form of prayer, where it bubbles up, that there is a sense in which there are deeds and effects which follow. So there are actually something involved going on, if you understand what I mean. And then we move into the fifth dwelling place, and we find these two very distinct allegories going on, which actually make the core of this whole section. And the first is the really famous silkworm. Actually, both of these analogies are very famous, all three in a sense, but this is the one that people really focus on so much, because this analogy arises from Teresa's desire to express the experience and the notion of the prayer of union. How on earth can you describe that? And so she resorts to this beautiful analogy. And through the image of the silkworm working hard, working away to weave its silk into a cocoon, she speaks of how all the practices that we do, like prayer, penance, times of silence, mortifications, readings, listening to sermons, all of these are the action of the soul spinning this beautiful little cocoon, which she describes as the place where God will dwell. And then as the silkworm dies in the cocoon, so the soul begins to die to itself, and its life is now hid within Christ. And once a soul is indeed dead to itself and its attachments, it can then break forth from the cocoon, transformed, as does a small white butterfly. It's a really wonderful analogy. I mean, I don't know if that's how silkworms actually work, but it's ingenious because she gives this beautiful image from nature. We kind of can understand what she's meaning about dying to self, but she's also expressing that whole understanding of the dying of Christ and rising again with him, and how our life is sort of married with that of Christ. So we have to die to then live. And of course, Paul expresses this very beautifully in his letters, where he talks about dying to sin and rising to new life in him. And of course, Teresa actually remembers that too, and she says, "Oh, I think I read that somewhere," which is beautiful the way she says that. It's kind of a bit like all of us, isn't it? Can't quite remember the chapter and verse, but we do remember the important sort of quote and understanding. So she's speaking on highly theological terms, but she's expressing it through prayer, and she's using the medium of allegory and the imagination to actually do that. So very complex, but also it comes across as very kind of clear and simple. Having made the point of the soul's death in Christ, Teresa then introduces a very important analogy that will take us through the rest of the dwelling places, right into the centre, the heart of the castle. And of course, this is namely the analogy of marriage and all its preparatory stages beforehand. So in Teresa's day, I guess it's a little bit like today, but I suppose it was probably much more structured and formal than in those days. When people got engaged, they didn't get engaged immediately. There was a whole formal process of, I say, stages in which they sought to get to know each other. And first it was whether they like each other, and then whether they could love. And it sounds to me that this kind of, the language that Teresa is talking in, it sounds very much like it's a kind of arranged marriage. It's not a marriage that's spurred on by love, but I actually might be wrong. It might be, a marriage which is precipitated by love, or it may be the love of Christ that draws us to himself and then we learn how to love Christ. Or it may happen on the other side, of course, that maybe an individual soul who literally just falls in love. So I think there are many more kind of, nuances to this image of the marriage. But the one that Teresa really wants to give us is this idea that it's a gentle process of getting to know the beloved before you get married. So if these two decide that actually they kind of like each other, there could be some love and relationship there, then they have more meetings together, establish that they'll have another series of meetings to really deepen their knowledge and understanding. And so, in a sense, the way Teresa is explaining it really does help us understanding what's she talking about the prayer of union. So she's talking about the prayer of union as something which grows and develops and deepens. It's not like, bam, the prayer of union, but actually it is a gradual process of deepening. And we're going to see that as we enter into the other phases, the other rooms, in fact, that it's that progression of knowledge and of love and of deepening that draws the soul and God into a much closer relationship of union, which I think is probably what she's trying to talk about. So the soul gets to know God, and God becomes central to the soul, and they're held together by this kind of love. So in this fifth dwelling place, we are in the preliminary forms of the prayer of union that grows and develops over time. So, of course, when we think about bridal language like this, Teresa's not talking out of the blue. Bridal language in relation to the soul and spiritual growth actually is a real hallmark of the Christian spiritual tradition. It's right there from the beginning in the Song of Songs in the Bible. And that was often the text that people had as their go-to to try and express the love of God for the soul and the soul's response, but also this notion of having a deep understanding and experience of the beloved. But we also see it running through, as I say, through the whole Christian tradition. So if we think about the medieval period for a moment, then we've got Bridget of Sweden, and a number of her visions are all on bridal imagery. And if you remember, those of you who came to the book group on Marjorie Kemp, there we are, good old Marjorie has some very interesting take on the imagery of the union as bridal. Interesting, of course, that Julian doesn't have any bridal imagery at all. That's one to ponder, maybe. And then there is one other analogy that sort of edges into this book 5, this fifth dwelling place, which I kind of like, which is her plea that that love isn't idle. We may have this sort of deep relationship with God, but don't rest on your laurels, kind of thing. Because even though you have this special walk with God, you need to be especially careful and attentive in the exercise of the virtues, and particularly in relationship to love of neighbour, to humility, and to embracing suffering. And she concludes this lovely little image of the lizards of sin, which can creep in to the dwelling place through the cracks in the door. And I think that's a really wonderful little sort of aside, because any of you who've been to Spain and have left your door open at night when it's really hot will know that the lizards can easily get into the house. But so it's really based on kind of known experience, but also it really expresses that notion that takes us right back to the beginning of the interior castle, where both in the courtyard, but also in, I think it's the second dwelling place, where she talks about the snakes and the poisonous creatures that can harm, and they are seen as sin in itself, which is also a very interesting concept in the sense that sin is not something that comes from us, but sin is something external to us and that we have to push away. And I think that's a very helpful notion of seeing what sin is. Whether you want to explore that later, I'll leave that up to you, but I think that's really helpful, that sin is not something that's part of who we are, but it's actually something that we are inflicted with. Very interesting. So Teresa's analogies, they are deeply effective. They really work, as they work not only on the imaginative level, but also in a kind of non-verbal recognition. We know what she's talking about. Somehow, we may not quite have necessarily experienced what she's talking about, but we kind of get it. It's like when someone tries to explain to you what a sunrise looks like, and they use lots of different images and analogies, to express what they've seen in a sunrise. And we kind of relate it, not necessarily to what they've seen, but to our experience. And I think that's what's working here, is that she's using analogies, she's trying to express so that we can relate, we can find some kind of connection and understanding with what she said. So that's my kind of little introduction to her analogies, which I think are one of one of the key things about particularly this interior castle that so many people have found useful and helpful going forward in their own spiritual lives. And I hope able to have a good conversation about that. Because, of course, next week we're going to move into a whole different sphere, which is the sixth dwelling place. And that's going to be a much, much longer section. She really dwells. It looks like a third of the book is actually devoted to this sixth dwelling place. So it's really good to pause at this point and see what's she doing in this fifth dwelling.